10 men were executed. More than 100 operations destroyed. 30 agents lost. Decades of intelligence work, recruitment, cultivation, years of risk and patience, erased. The CIA called it the worst security breach in the agency's history. The Senate called it the most devastating espionage case in American history. And when investigators finally traced everything back to its source, after 9 years, after 10 executions, after more than $2 million paid in cash, they found him. Not in Moscow, not in a safe house somewhere, not hiding, at his desk, in Langley, in the same building where the men he had burned used to have their files. His name was Rick Ames, and he needed to pay his bills. Before we go back to the beginning, one thing you need to understand about what the CIA actually is and what it means when someone inside it decides to sell everything it has. Rick Ames was not born a traitor. No traitor is. He was born in River Falls, Wisconsin on May 26, 1941, the son of Carlton Ames, a college professor who later became a CIA officer. It was that paternal inheritance, not of wealth but of belonging to a secret world, that shaped Rick's path from early on. As a teenager, he worked as an agency intern. At 21 in 1962, he was officially hired as a records analyst while simultaneously attending George Washington University, where he graduated in 1967. This was the era when the CIA was an institution wrapped in mystery and a sense of patriotic purpose that attracted a certain kind of man. Intelligent, discreet, with an appetite for complexity. Rick Ames fit that profile, at least on the surface. The problem was that he was never exceptional. By any measure the CIA used to evaluate its officers: analytical ability, operational discipline, source recruitment, psychological resilience. Ames landed in the middle, sometimes below the middle. He drank, and he drank heavily. He missed deadlines. He was careless with classified documents, at one point leaving a set of secret files on the New York City subway in an incident that generated a formal internal report. But the CIA of the 1960s, 70s, and well into the 80s had a particular culture. You did not fire a veteran. You tolerated him. You reassigned him. You placed him where he could do the least damage, and so Rick Ames was moved from post to post. Turkey, where he recruited Soviet agents in the late 60s. New York, Washington, and finally Mexico City in the early 80s. Accumulating years of service without accumulating much distinction. His first marriage fell apart. Nancy Segabarth, his first wife, also worked for the CIA, and those who knew the couple understood that things were not going well. They divorced in 1983. The process was expensive. The debts began to pile up. It was in Mexico City that Rick Ames met Maria del Rosario Casas Dupuy. She was Colombian, educated, ambitious. She had worked as a CIA informant in contact with the Colombian embassy. Ames fell for her. He began spending money to impress her. Gifts, restaurants, travel. The money disappeared faster than it came in. When he returned to Washington in the early 80s to take a post in the Soviet division, Ames had a concrete problem. He was broke. He owed money from the divorce. He owed credit card balances. He owed the lifestyle he had promised to maintain alongside Rosario, whom he married in 1985, the same year he began betraying his country. The financial pressure was real and growing, and it was at exactly that point of vulnerability that the opportunity appeared, or that he created the opportunity, depending on how you read the facts. In early 1985, Ames was assigned a routine task: maintain contact with Sergei Chuvakin, a Soviet diplomat based in Washington who worked under diplomatic cover as a representative of the Soviet Embassy's Arms Control Division. A common arrangement that gave KGB-connected officials legitimate reasons to meet with American counterparts. The CIA was hoping to recruit him. It was legitimate work. He scheduled a lunch, then another lunch. And at some point in that sequence of meetings, something shifted inside Rick Ames. It was not an epiphany. It was not an ideological crisis of conscience. According to Ames himself years later, it was a pragmatic and almost mundane decision. He needed money. The Soviets had money. He had information they wanted. It was a transaction. The envelope Ames slid across the table to Chuvakin that April day in the restaurant Chadwick's contained something worth far more than the $50,000 he asked for. It contained the names. These were high-level Soviet officials who were secretly working for the CIA. Men who had risked everything, family, freedom, life itself, to transmit information from the heart of the Soviet system to the Americans. Men the CIA had cultivated for years with surgical patience. Ames handed over those names the way you hand someone a grocery list. What happened in the months that followed should have been impossible to ignore. On June 13, 1985, barely 2 months after that first meeting at Chadwick's, Ames went further, much further. At a lunch with Chuvakin at a Washington restaurant, he arrived carrying a grocery bag. Inside it were documents. An enormous volume of classified material that included virtually everything the CIA had on its operations against the Soviet Union. Names of agents, communication methods, cover identities, active operations. In a single meeting, carrying a shopping bag as if he had just run an errand, Ames handed the Soviets the equivalent of decades of American intelligence work. The KGB was stunned with gratitude. The Americans had no idea what had just happened. And then the executions began. Adolf Tolkachev was arrested that same June 13, 1985. The KGB moved the same day Ames handed over the material. Tolkachev was a senior engineer at the Moscow Institute of Radio Engineering, specializing in radar systems and military avionics. What he had provided the CIA was not stealth technology. It was something more valuable in a different way. The precise technical specifications of Soviet radar systems. That data allowed American engineers to design aircraft that those radars could not detect. The CIA later estimated that the strategic value of Tolkachev's information ran into the billions of dollars. He was executed in September 1986. Then came Valery Martinov and Sergei Motorin, 2 KGB officers stationed in Washington who had become American informants. The Soviet method for retrieving them was both ingenious and cruel. In November 1985, a Soviet defector named Vitaly Yurchenko, who had spent months being debriefed by the CIA, suddenly announced that he wanted to go back to the Soviet Union. The KGB seized the opportunity. Martinov was assigned as part of the honor guard that would escort Yurchenko home to Moscow. When the plane landed, it was Martinov who was arrested, not Yurchenko, who went back to his KGB job as if nothing had happened. Martinov was executed in May 1987. Motorin, arrested in Moscow in late 1985, was shot in February 1987. And then there was Dmitry Polyakov, the most valuable of all. A general in the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, Polyakov had served the Americans for more than 20 years, providing data on Soviet strategic missiles, nuclear doctrine, anti-tank weapons, and chemical and biological warfare programs. Former CIA Director Robert Gates described him as the jewel in the crown of American human sources inside the Soviet Union. Polyakov was arrested in 1986 and shot in March 1988. When CIA analysts learned of his execution, some wept openly. Name after name. Execution after execution. Inside Langley, what was happening had a technical name: asset compromise. And it was happening at a scale and speed that had no precedent. Within 2 years, the CIA had lost virtually its entire network of human sources inside the Soviet Union. More than 100 operations compromised. More than 30 agents lost. The problem was that no one knew why. The CIA has, among its many functions, one that rarely appears in films: counterintelligence. It is the art of protecting the agency itself from enemy penetration, detecting spies within the organization, identifying leaks before they destroy operations. In theory. In practice, by the mid-1980s, CIA counterintelligence was in a state of disrepair. The man who had dominated that department for decades was James Jesus Angleton, a figure so consumed by paranoia and so effective in that paranoia that he eventually paralyzed the agency with his suspicions. Angleton saw Soviet spies everywhere, and by seeing them where they did not exist, he failed to see them where they did. He was forced out in 1974, leaving behind a department that was traumatized, deeply suspicious of itself, and profoundly resistant to the idea that there was a mole inside the house. That was the environment when the losses began accumulating in 1985 and 1986. There were attempts at investigation, small, timid, and inconsequential. The most comfortable explanation, the one many inside the CIA preferred to believe, was that there were operational security problems. Perhaps communications were being intercepted. Perhaps the Soviets had discovered the agents through technical means, and there was a factor that complicated everything. A former CIA officer named Edward Lee Howard had defected to the Soviet Union in 1985, taking information about some operations with him. For months, Howard served as a convenient explanation for some of the losses, making it easier to avoid accepting that the whole was far, far larger. The mole hypothesis, an infiltrator inside the CIA transmitting information directly to Moscow, was raised but never investigated with the seriousness it demanded. It implied that someone inside the family had betrayed the family. And closed organizations, especially secret ones, have enormous psychological resistance to that conclusion. And so, Rick Ames kept going to work. In 1986, he was transferred to Rome, where the CIA maintained a station inside the American embassy. There, meetings with his Soviet handlers took place in restaurants, on busy streets, in the kinds of places where two men talking looked like exactly what they appeared to be. Two men talking. Colleagues who served alongside him in Rome later described his spending as blatantly excessive. Vacations across Europe, monthly telephone bills running $5,000, a lifestyle that simply did not match the salary of a mid-level intelligence officer. The Rome station security officer brought Ames's spending and drinking to the attention of the senior CIA official in the city. Nothing happened. It is worth pausing on those two words. Nothing happened. Not a formal inquiry. Not a financial review. Not even a conversation on record. A security officer saw something alarming, reported it through the correct channel, and the system absorbed it and produced no response whatsoever. The warning went in and disappeared. Ames returned to Washington in 1989, and the money kept arriving. And this is where the story becomes disturbing in a different way. Not because Ames was too clever to be caught, but because the warning signs were so obvious, so loud, that the CIA's failure to act on them for so long reveals something dark about how the agency functioned. In 1989, back in Washington, Ames purchased a house in Arlington, Virginia. A large, attractive house in a good part of the city. The price was $540,000. He paid cash. To understand what that means, a senior CIA officer's salary at the time was somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 a year. To buy that house in cash, Ames would have had to save every single dollar of his salary for nearly a decade, spending absolutely nothing on anything else. Which, given that he drank regularly, carried substantial debts, and had recently gone through an expensive divorce, was mathematically impossible. Then came the Jaguar. Bordeaux metallic, brand new, parked in the CIA lot while colleagues drove cars they were still paying off. Then came the home renovations. Then the European vacations. Then the expensive wines. Then the credit card balances paid in full every single month, without delay. Without stress. Rosario wore clothes that cost more than many colleagues earned in a month. Colleagues noticed. Of course they noticed. Some casual questions were asked, the way people ask when they want to know something without appearing to be asking. Ames had a rehearsed answer. Rosario's family in Colombia had money, an inheritance, properties. Nothing remarkable. Nobody investigated further. This is not individual incompetence. It is something more systemic and, in some ways, more troubling. The CIA of the 1980s had no robust program for monitoring the finances of its own personnel. No periodic checks of bank statements, no automatic alerts for abnormal purchases, no formal process for investigating the gap between an employee's declared salary and their actual standard of living. There was trust, and Ames exploited that trust methodically. And still, when subjected to polygraph tests in 1986 and again in 1991, Ames passed. No alarms, no indicators of deception. 2 lie detector tests at an agency that treated the polygraph as a central security tool, and no result, which says something about Rick Ames, and perhaps something even more revealing about the polygraph. While the CIA slept, a small group within it was beginning to wake up. Sandra Grimes and Jean Vertefeuille were two veteran analysts in the Soviet division who had spent years building, with almost obsessive dedication, a database of every loss. Names of compromised agents. Dates. What each one knew. Who inside the CIA had had access to each specific operation. The idea was to map the leak backwards, starting from what was lost, determine who knew what and when. It was painstaking, tedious, deeply frustrating work, and for years their efforts were ignored or minimized inside the agency. In 1991, after the scale of the losses finally made it impossible to keep pretending there was no human problem, the CIA and FBI agreed to form a joint task force specifically to identify the mole. It was a step that had been delayed for years by institutional distrust. The two agencies had a long, complicated history of not sharing information. But it was now happening. Too late to save the agents already executed, and perhaps just in time to prevent further damage. There was another complicating factor. In 1985, at the same time Ames began betraying his country, an FBI agent named Robert Hansen had also begun selling secrets to the Soviets. Hansen was intelligent, careful, and extraordinarily disciplined. He never revealed his real identity to the Soviets. The losses caused by Hansen overlapped with those caused by Ames in ways that made it difficult to investigate either of them in isolation. For years, investigators debated whether there was one mole or two, whether the losses had a single source or multiple ones. The debate itself slowed everything down. But when the data Grimes and Vertefeuille had assembled was finally cross-referenced with systematic rigor, a pattern emerged that could not be dismissed. Ames had had access to virtually every operation that had been compromised. In many cases, he was one of the very few people with access to that specific set of information. There was still emotional resistance to accepting that it was him. Still the defensive comfort of thinking that a 30-year veteran colleague could not be the problem. But the task force now had a name. And with a name came resources. And then came the trash. FBI investigators began regularly going through Ames's household garbage, which in the United States is legal without a warrant. And in that trash they found fragments of paper. Drafts that had been partially destroyed, but not destroyed enough. Notes. Pieces of documents that, reassembled with patience, suggested communication with a foreign intelligence service. Enough to justify more intensive surveillance. Beginning in May 1993, the FBI built a comprehensive monitoring operation around Ames. They tracked his every movement. They monitored his communications. And in October of that year, investigators observed him making a chalk mark on a mailbox, the classic tradecraft signal of a dead drop, indicating that material was ready to be collected. There were no longer any alternative hypotheses. There was certainty. Still, the FBI waited. They wanted the case completely solid before moving, and there was a practical and urgent reason not to rush. Ames had a trip to Moscow scheduled for February 22, 1994. Once inside Russia, he would be beyond American reach forever. On the morning of February 21, 1994, Rick Ames walked out of his house in Arlington. He got into his car. It was a cold, gray winter morning in Washington. He probably had on his face the expression of a government employee heading to work without much thought. The expression of someone who does not expect this day to be different from any other. Two FBI agents approached the vehicle. They knocked on the window. Rick Ames rolled it down. The most damaging spy in CIA history was arrested on a quiet street in Arlington, Virginia, without a single word of resistance. In the days that followed the arrest, a scene repeated itself in several offices inside Langley. Veterans of the Soviet division sitting in front of lists of agents, staring at names, doing silent arithmetic. Who was on Ames's list? When they had been arrested? What had happened afterward? The numbers were devastating. At least 10 human sources working for the Americans inside the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc had been executed as a direct result of Ames's betrayals. Others had been imprisoned and sentenced to long terms of hard labor. More than 100 operations compromised. More than 3 decades of recruitment work and network cultivation erased. And beneath the numbers, the human stories that never fully came to light. Dmitry Polyakov, codenamed Top Hat inside the CIA, who did not spy for money, who insisted on remaining in place to keep helping, whom CIA veteran Jean Vertefeuille described in tears after Ames's arrest. He didn't do it for money. He insisted on staying to help us. It was a bad day when we lost him. Polyakov never knew he had been handed over by a colleague of the man he had trusted, Valery Martinov, who was brought back to Moscow disguised as part of an honor guard with no way to refuse without confirming his own guilt, who spent nearly 2 years imprisoned before being executed, whose son grew up being told that his father had committed crimes against the state. That son, Alexander Martinov, later emigrated to the United States and became a police officer in Norfolk, Virginia, serving the country for which his father had died. Adolf Tolkachev, arrested the same day Ames delivered his cash in June 1985, who provided intelligence that cost the Soviet Union billions in technological advantage, whose information on radar systems and stealth aviation shaped American air combat doctrine for a generation. Sergei Motorin, whose Soviet court presented as evidence of treason the fact that he had purchased a waterbed with FBI money. These men were not merely intelligence assets. They were people who had made a choice, for reasons that varied, some ideological, some financial, some deeply personal, to risk everything in order to pass along information they believed mattered. And they were handed over, not because of a sophisticated failure of tradecraft, not because of advanced Soviet interception technology, not because of bad luck, but because a colleague needed to pay his bills. The prosecution of Aldrich Ames was relatively brief. The evidence was overwhelming, and he negotiated a guilty plea in exchange for a more lenient sentence for Rosario. On April 28, 1994, Aldrich Ames was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rosario received 63 months. She was released in 1998. Their assets were forfeited. The house in Arlington, the cars, the money in the accounts. $547,000 was turned over to the Justice Department's Victim Assistance Fund. In the words Ames spoke to the court, he was characteristically free of drama. There was no ideological speech, no attempt to cast himself as a tragic figure. He said he had made wrong decisions for reasons he recognized as inadequate, that he was sorry, that he understood there was no possible repair. Words. The words of a man who had traded human lives for money and who now needed to say something appropriate to the moment. But there are things you cannot seize in a forfeiture. You cannot seize the memory of Dmitry Polyakov being led to an execution site. You cannot seize the moment Valery Martinov landed in Moscow as part of an honor guard and realized when he saw the agents waiting that there was no way back. You cannot seize the childhood of the sons and daughters of men who disappeared without official explanation, leaving behind only a permanent absence and the weight of state suspicion that fell over any family marked as a traitor's family. The Ames case produced real reforms inside the CIA. New financial monitoring protocols were implemented. The verification program was intensified. The culture of reporting suspicious colleagues was formally encouraged rather than discouraged. But institutional reforms are a response to the past, not a guarantee against the future. Robert Hansen, who had been spying in parallel with Ames since 1985, and who in some ways was the more disciplined traitor because he never once revealed his real identity to the Soviets, was not arrested until 2001, 15 years after his betrayals began. The question the Ames case raises, and that is never fully answered, is not a technical one. It is not about protocols or financial anomaly detection software. It is about something more fundamental. How does an organization reckon with the fact that its members are human, that they carry debts, addictions, resentments, unmet ambitions? That institutional loyalty, however carefully cultivated, can be bought or eroded. In interviews given after his imprisonment, Ames sometimes tried to frame his betrayals in philosophical terms, as professional disillusionment with the CIA, as cynicism about the Cold War, as skepticism about the real value of what the EO agency did. But the investigators and the record itself are more prosaic. The central motivation at the start was paying off debts. And after the debts were paid, it was maintaining the lifestyle that the betrayals had made possible. The cynicism came later, as a retroactive justification for something that had begun as a transaction. which is perhaps the most disturbing part of all. There is no Greek tragedy here. There is no fall of a great man. There is a mediocre man who needed money, who had the access required to obtain it in a way that no one, he correctly calculated for nearly a decade, would notice. Aldrich Ames died on January 5, 2026. He was 84 years old. He was serving his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. He died in prison. The outcome he had presumably told himself would never happen when he was young and harboring vaguely defined ambitions about an intelligence career. Death came quietly, without dramatic note, in a federal prison corridor that probably looked like every other corridor in every other federal prison. The men he handed over did not reach that age. Dmitry Polyakov was shot at 66. Valery Martinov was executed at 41. Sergei Motorin died at probably under 40 years old. Adolf Tolkachev was in his early 60s when he was arrested and taken to a fate that was never fully documented in the public record. The United States Senate, in its 1994 report, called the Ames case the most devastating espionage case in our nation's history. That is not hyperbole. It is an accounting. More than 100 operations destroyed. More than 30 agents lost. At least 10 executed. Decades of intelligence work erased. All of it done by a man carrying a grocery bag and a bill he needed to pay. The agents executed because of Aldrich Ames have no public monuments. No ceremonies named after them. Their names appear only in declassified documents, in congressional reports, in the files of an agency that took far too long to look at itself honestly. But they existed. They had families, made choices, and possessed enough courage to do what they did with full knowledge of the risk. They knew the rule. In the game they had entered, mistakes were paid for in lives. The mistake was not theirs. That is all. And that is all that needs to be said.